All right, so today is May 5th, 2020, although I think it's May 4th for you, Amit. And we have on the wonderful Amit Pradhan. Amit Pradhan? How do you pronounce your last name?
You did well. It's Pradhan, but Pradhan
Pradhan.
is perfect.
Okay, cool. We have on the wonderful Amit Pradhan. Um, why don't we start off with just an intro? Because you've had, like many people on this podcast, you've had quite an interesting life.
Yeah, thanks. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. So by way of background, as a kid, grew up in India in a small town called Pune, which is a very big town now and crowded as can be. Went to Sydney, Australia in my teens, in my late teens, did university there, uni as they call it, worked part-time in the tech industry, and shortly thereafter started a company with my older brother actually, and he was still living in India. Tech company, we did all right. We got acquired. Part of that acquisition was moving to the US. It was LA initially, and then that was right at the end of the dot-com bust, which then transitioned me into San Francisco, literally to meet with a potential client that we were already servicing. And very long story short, 20 years later, this is still my home base. And it's been an incredible journey. I've been in the Silicon Valley ecosystem for a long time as a creator, as well as an investor. So on the creation side, a lot of it has just been deep tech. I started an AI lab 16 years ago now, focused on the future of the interface and how we would use AI to transition from touch and type to things that we see today, other sensory inputs, gesture, facial recognition, voice recognition, etc. But the main focus was for it to be on the edge. And it was an architectural decision built on speed and efficiency and all of these things. But it started tying into a philosophical viewpoint of privacy. And we see that today at the highest possible level, conversations we have being, essentially listened to by your Alexas of the world or the Siris of the world, facial recognition in the streets, and all of it architecturally is being processed in the cloud, which means your data has already left the building, right? And we get into these conversations of, well, who has it? What are they doing with it? How are they being responsible or being irresponsible? And we start seeing that with then the stories evolving of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, right? Where that data being used in ways that in the end where you can argue this, but turned an election of the world's most powerful country, right? And in many cases, the conversation tends to be around, well, yeah, maybe they're going to advertise based on my data, or they're going to try and sell me product based on my data. And I always say that's a privileged position of someone who lives in a relatively free country, as certainly I do here in the US. But when you live in a majority of the world's countries, things that you say that might have to do with the local leadership can have repercussions that might lead to persecution and prosecution, or in the extreme case, execution. And so privacy became such a big factor for me. And I started thinking about the underlying architectural data models that was leading to this, ongoing loss of privacy. And that started intersecting then with the solutions for it. And those were all steeped in this idea of decentralization that you know so well. And I started getting involved in obviously the currency, but also from a technology perspective, and started thinking about both the evangelism as well as building solutions around that. And a big part of the lessons learned during that time outside of privacy and decentralization were the deepest influence is coming from capital. And how do we find ways to make sure that the capital that comes in isn't the reason why people are making the kind of decisions they're making for how they build? And that resulted in me creating I was always investing independently, but we created the first of the funding vehicles. So Jet Ventures, which is a corporate venture fund model, strategic investments in startups where value can be added by the corporate venture partners. And so it's not just capital that gets deployed. And that dovetailed then into the creation of the Silicon Valley Blockchain Society, which was a couple of years ago, focused on bringing long-term, thoughtful institutional capital to then combine with all of the different family offices, venture funds, angel investments that were coming into the decentralized space. And so my journey through meandering through deep tech and the underlying philosophies around why we were doing what we were doing, to finding responsible ways of deploying capital, then kind of got covered by this philosophy I always use, which is everything that we do, and certainly I can only speak for myself, I want it to create a net positive impact on humanity. And so I do a lot of work with foundations and some of the most incredible nonprofits around. I sit on the board of the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is one of the finest refugee agencies. They have camps at point of most strife, and it's a very dangerous, difficult thing to do. And the idea is not just helping with access to things like capital, which is very important, but how do you use technology? How do you use the powers of AI and blockchain to solve for some of the challenges that helping the lives of 10 million refugees a year represents? And so my kind of multiple hats tend to cross these paths. And whenever people say, okay, this is all very interesting, how do you divide your time? I'm a responsible leader with the BMW Foundation. I sit on an advisory, a global mobility council for BMW, the car company. And I always say these are not divisions of time. These are how I compound all of my activities, because they all feed into each other. So by way of a long introduction, that's my life in a nutshell.
I'm really glad that you kind of went through that because we've known each other for I think 2 years now, but I didn't really, to me it wasn't, because I knew that you were working with Jet Ventures and with Zero Labs and SVBS or Norwegian Refugee Council, but now kind of going through kind of the whole history, it seems clear to me that obviously the overriding theme is kind of impacting people in a positive way, but I feel like the other overriding theme is data. Because just the way that you were describing it was Zero, it was a way of people to kind of interact with AI, obviously data driven, in a more kind of intuitive way. And with Jet Ventures, it sounds like you were really working on ways to use data in a way that's more equitable. And obviously blockchains are, I think, a radical new way to organize data, especially these decentralized blockchains that we see popping up. So data is such a tricky issue to talk about today, I feel like, because it's so complicated, to have an actual, and this, people talking heads go on TV all the time and talk about data, but it's such a nuanced topic and complex topic. And today with stuff like contact tracing, right, we're basically giving people a blank check to all our data. And with stuff like the big ad companies out there, what do you feel like the role of data is like today, and what do you feel like it should be? Where do you feel like the potential is, or the kind of the dangers are, and how we're using data today?
I love that. I love the question, and I love how you framed it. To me, people often have said or hear the quote, "Data is the new oil," right? This is commonly thrown around, and being in the world of AI for as long as I've been and seeing kind of the capability curve, to me, there's that the metaphor is that data is the new nuclear fuel, in that as a raw commodity, exponential impact that can be created from it because of where we are going with cognitive AI. And you see that with what people call the FAMGA companies, I call them GAFABAT, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Tesla. They kind of represent that genre of companies that are by default inhaling the data exhaust plumes that we put out, right? We live on their platforms. Everywhere we go, the things we say, the actions we take, whether they're what I call thinking of data actions in the form of explicit. I check in somewhere, I make a transaction, I send a message, right? Implicit, which is the fact that you and I show up in a room together and you don't have to check in. Already a little n-dimensional AI cloud is being generated around your head of the fact that you and I have known each other for X amount of time. We're in that room for the first time, but there are 4 other people who were there with you. You're there all the time. This is my second time. All of these things are what I call the implicit data events. And then you have the power of cognition, which is what the AI systems of the GAFA-bats are able to do with that information and do with that data and make it incredibly rich. But that also comes incredibly powerful, right? And to me, in so many ways, it's not just about thinking about, oh, is there an equitable share of this data that we should have? Or wait, should they not have this data? Or should they be doing different things with it? What happens when you extrapolate GAFA-BAT to add another G, which is government, right? And you can imagine that in the context of certain countries versus others. I really look at it and say, this is, if you think about what's happened right now with COVID, right? Or let's talk about Corona in general, because that's going to be the world we live in going forward. What we've realized is that capitalism in the form that we have right now turned out to be incredibly fragile, and so fragile that 1 month broke it. It couldn't survive it didn't have the resilience to survive 1 month of a shutdown. And so you have to start thinking really actively. And I'd love to talk about what this shutdown means and where it came from. Let's think about it as the Great Reset. But coming back to the idea of the brittleness of capitalism and the foundational challenges, and tying back to data, takes me to this work that I've been doing for a while, actually, around the concept that I call the universal earned income. So universal basic income, we all get it, and it's I'm sure it's a debate that you and I can have. But the idea of the universal earned income being that it's not we exist, therefore we should have income. It's we exist in a digital world and we're giving out an exhaust. And unlike a carbon exhaust, this exhaust has value if it can be harnessed in the right way. And we can start creating models that monetize that exhaust. Within context, this is not a socialist view of saying everyone should get the same amount, because our data exhaust plumes look different, feel different, have different value. But if we can start creating models around monetization of those plumes, but applying the same AI models that GAFA-BAT are using to create a lot of value on top of raw data, then we can start creating income streams back. And eventually the reason I call it the universal earned income, is to draw the same connection to UBI, in that here's a way to create a default income stream based on the lives that we're already leading. And, I like to focus on the next billion. It's about 300 and 400 million people in South Asia who are coming online on these $6, $10, Android devices. The same applies in, Africa and South America. And how do you get, between $2 and $6 a day in income over the next decade to the next billion, so that when these things happen, when the COVID, Corona, shutdowns happen, you're not sitting there thinking, well, I can't survive. I can't make rent. I can't pay for food. I need to suck on the teats of government, which, as you know, capitalists hate the idea of. And yet a Republican administration run by, it's hard to tell what the ideology of Donald Trump is, but run by a businessman CEO went out and issued something like a UBI in the end, didn't they? It was the $1,200. And we can go into great detail of how botched it was, how it took so long, people didn't get it, it didn't achieve what it was supposed to. It's nothing compared to what is needed. Compare that and contrast that to countries in Europe, for instance, who laid this out, or New Zealand, Australia, that covered $2,000 a month for a period of time. The bottom line is, much vaunted capitalism instantly shut down, went sucked on the teats of government, because the economic system was so flawed. And to your question of the value of data, to me, it's not just a question of, I want to protect my privacy and I don't want GAFA-BAT to be all powerful, or monetization. It has to be done in a way that it becomes one part of the economic foundation that we go forward from here on, so that we don't have these tragic and fatal, to be honest, points of failure in the core systems we live in, one of which is the economic system.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And, I really love your term of universal earned income, because I feel like one of the ideological kind of arguments against UBI is that, well, it's just a handout. Why should people get the same amount of money? And I feel like if you look at the structuring of your proposal, which we talked about before, it really is, it's not a conditional handout, right? It's based on inherent value generated by people, but it makes a distinction that this is value that people are creating, and people should get a cut of the value that they're creating. And so I think that's a really important distinction for when you call it the UEI. So another kind of thing, like one one way people think about the internet boom in China, in the kind of the venture space in China, is that they think, they put it this way, that data is a resource that is cheap to collect. And with the proper kind of refining, it can have, non-zero value and higher value than the cost to collect. And so basically the idea is that all these internet companies, they're basically, living on that arbitrage where people think data is cheap, but it's actually quite valuable. And so my question, let me throw kind of not a potential drawback of the UEI model, but kind of like how you would view this kind of scenario. So when I was, I used to work in AI before doing blockchain stuff. And so when I was a consultant at Morgan Stanley, Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, one proposal that we threw out, that I don't know if they took or not, the one proposal that we threw out there and every other wealth management firm in the world was that, well, why don't you use big data to quantify which of your customers have the longest lifetime value? So your wealth managers, you want to work with your customers for 20, 30 years. How do you know which ones to focus on? And so we kind of proposed this big data model using machine learning or whatever as a way to kind of calculate, well, what is their life trajectory going to look like? How much money are they going to make in the future, and how much of a cut can they make? And so here's my point, is that, people aren't, in the views of that, in the eyes of that model, people aren't created equal. And so if you're a young, educated male who's working in finance, who's working in tech, then you're a great customer to have for the bank for the next 30 years. If you're, you don't fit any of those things, and if you work in a field that's less financially lucrative, then from a financial standpoint, from the standpoint of our model, it doesn't make sense for the bank to focus on you. They should fire you as a client. And I think in the eyes of, the advertisers, Facebook, Google, I don't know what their models look like, but I would imagine that the higher income you have, the more they want you as a user, because you're going to click on more ads and buy more stuff. And so how does that factor into the UEI model, where you might have, 1 billion unbanked, for example, who've had incomes of under, let's say, $1,000 or $5,000 a year. They're not buying, they're not clicking a lot of ads, they're not buying a lot of stuff. How does that impact the UEI model? Would that mean that they have lower income streams? Like how are we what kind of value are we going to be extracting from this data?
That's a great question. And honestly, I do get that a lot. And if you think about data in a purely transactional perspective of, and the example you gave of, Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, lifetime targeting of customers by value, sure. But data in the evolution that we're getting to, and that's why I do tend to focus on the idea of, AI and the cognitive aspects of what you learn from that data. Let me give you an example. Very timely, right? We're talking about COVID-19, we're talking about viruses and bacteria. And if you're Roche, you're building the vaccine of the future for what we're dealing with, or the antibiotic of the future, the data that they're using is not limited only to a transactional amount that you or I spend at Pete's as we buy our $6 lattes because we have that affordability. The data that is more relevant to them is of Rashida, the refugee who lives in a camp outside of Syria, and the petri dish that she's living in with the amount of disease and germs and bacteria that she's being exposed to, and what impact that's having on her body temperature, the number of steps she's taking, what is the proximity of people around her, how often are alerts around epidemics or even pandemics being sent out in those camps that she is being exposed to. That is far more relevant and far more important, especially when you can start contextualizing it and delivering it in the form of what I call intelligence back to a company like Roche. And suddenly you realize she didn't spend any money. She didn't buy those lattes at Pete's. She wasn't investing in a mutual fund portfolio. It doesn't matter. There is context for why there is value in her existence. The movements of the next billion, of how they move from one area of work or within cities, for city planners, for local state governments, for businesses. This is all exceedingly valuable, right? And so the way I look at data is not purely from here is a 10-cent transaction that was represented by this data. Can I earn 2 cents from that, right? It's about abstracting it. And I always like to use this metaphor. People love to contextualize their lives through metaphors. Think of it not as data being like a coffee bean, where we look at the bean and say, if this bean came from Colombia, then it is worth 10 cents. If this bean, starts coming from Ecuador, it's 7 cents. And guess what? I can actually get it from in Kenya for 1 cent, and it becomes a race to the bottom. But we're just directly equating, what is the value of that bean to its monetary value, right? And instead think of the Nespresso pod, right? The Nespresso pod doesn't get into these, it's 1 cent, half a cent. It's $3. You buy the pod for $3. And the reason you do is because it has a lot of value baked in. It's convenient. It goes into that espresso machine. It's got flavors. It's just the right dose. You don't have to calculate the number of beans. You don't have to grind them, right? And it gives you this wonderful caramel flavored espresso. That's where the value lies. And if you can start doing that, then it doesn't matter what the underlying, who bought it for what amount, you're able to monetize that value. So a lot of the work that we're doing intentionally is not around just the theoretical aspects of UEI from a data perspective. We're rolling out a platform called Rainfall. It's just rainfall.one, O-N-E. And it's basically all of the AI and the blockchain that allows this to all happen in a really easy container. So people can come in and give consent and add aspects of data from their life that they want Rainfall to have. They can set permissions, whether they want it to be anonymous or not. And Rainfall's AI starts taking that data and moving it up the value chain from raw data, up into information, knowledge, intelligence, and then getting into the part where the eventual outcomes of this all in real time will be the Nespresso pods that you can make available, whether to businesses or governments, and then drive the value that comes from that back to all of the creators, and algorithms to define the allocation. This is again not a socialist. If 100 people are there and the data earns $10, then everyone gets 10 cents. It doesn't work like that. You have to attribute value. But to your question, that value doesn't have to be purely based upon the transaction value of that raw data that came in.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's really about the data products that we're producing here. So, so when we first talked about Rainfall, I don't even think it was called Rainfall. When we first talked about this concept a few years ago, my recollection, let me know if this is matched the facts, because it was 2 years ago, but my recollection is that we were talking about in a market framework, where the idea was that there's a lot of people that need a lot of data that's really hard to collect. And people don't want to give up data because it's hard to collect, and they have no incentive to give up the data. And so through this kind of model where people are compensated for collecting data at a fair clip, like 85% or whatever the number was of the revenue that comes in, we'll put it all in the blockchain and make sure the rules are enforceable, and that will just have a big competitive advantage in the market. And so that's kind of how we'll push Rainfall out. However, like you mentioned, we just saw a Republican businessman president sign legislation that passed a one-time UBI for all Americans. And certainly, UBI or some form of UBI is happening all around the world. And, I find that kind of hilarious, because for years and years, people were like, there's no money, it'll wreck the economy, it's not going to work, it said this and that. And then it took like 2 weeks, and it was like, oh, well, we might as well do UBI. It's about time. And so it's kind of like, I'm not sure those arguments are really that valid. But so, one other term you mentioned was the Great Reset. So how do you think, given what's happening now, what kind of opportunity do you think that creates for all of us to kind of push through these paradigm changes in this time of crisis?
Yeah, the one thing to really start out this answer is that this reset was not a market force reset, right? So you could argue that 9/11 was some form of market forces, that they were geopolitical, but it triggered the collapse. It triggered 2008 was, market forces. Again, we can get into, the whole subprime issue and, what happened with the market around there. The dot-com crash was a lot of pain. And again, it was this idea of some form of market forces. This is let's just call it an earth force reset. It was a planetary reset, right? And I like to think of this in the metaphor of our landlady, let's just call her Earth, had just got one complaint too many, right? And here we were throwing these crazy hedonistic parties, the debauchery, the damage to the house, the drunken people leaving, the needles lying around, the empty cans, even maybe a dead body here or there. Weekend at Bernie's Planetary Edition, and finally it just came to a point where it was like, look, here's your warning. I can't take these complaints from the neighbors and the police anymore. This is your final warning. After this, it's going to be eviction, right? And there's a couple of ways that we can think about this reset, because here we are where we're probably going to be like this for 4 months. We're 2 months in, probably another 2 months of this slow rollout, and then we'll see another the states in the US, for example, that roll out too fast. Georgia, Florida already seeing a spike. We're going to live in this time till there is a vaccine. And within that model, look at kind of what we've done. Here we are, we're doing, for example, this conversation in 2 continents at the same time. We're doing all our meetings on Zoom or, Microsoft Team or Google Meet or whatever. We're spending more time with family, right? Whether we like it or not. We're seeing a whole bunch of these incredible classes online for free that were never available, and people are starting to look at those things. But we're also sitting here and moping, and we're waiting to go back to normal, and And we're making this big assumption that somehow normal was working, that normal was okay. And I'm not getting into a political or deep economics discussion around this, but normal was fundamentally not working. It's what brought us to where we are, right? So I have two parts out of this. We can look at, take all our plants and manufacturing, and 4 months from now or another 2 months from now, we're back to full tilt. All plants are operating at 24/7. Workers are being given 3 shifts to make up for lost wages. Production is at its maximum. You can imagine, like, car lots are so full of pent up supply that even though you really enjoyed the idea of not having to drive, that the not having to commute was awesome. Walking was so much more fun, and yes, it gave you exercise and you look better, you feel better. That $15,000 discount on a BMW, which you would never see, makes you go, wow, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to buy that 3 Series or 5 Series or what have you, right? And you can start seeing all of these actions taking us back to normal. We go back to not walking as much, not being as fit. And guess what? In that metaphor of our landlady coming back and saying, I told you guys this was the last notice, right? Boom, here's your eviction. And alternatively, there is this huge opportunity for us because we've been able to see something that we only spoke about theoretically. So, India as a good example, and maybe you can, attest to this from China perspective, but my dad was saying that he saw stars in the sky for the first time in 15 years in Pune, in India. I mean, we say that in hyperbole, but it is so incredibly true. The fact that they have not seen sky, a blue sky and stars have not been seen in India for 15 years. It's incredible, right? And so is there going to be this second part where we say, well, hold on a second. Let's go back to the principles of the economy in general, right? And even set aside UBI or UEI for now. Take the most used metric, the GDP, right? And you could have a GDP, which, yes, the normal calculations are consumption plus government spending plus total infrastructure spending plus net exports, right? That's your GDP. And what if we said, okay, well, we want to factor in those things. I'm not talking about a wonderful Bhutanese example of gross happiness, but sticking with the GDP, what if we added this idea of, what is the net activities that, or net steps that the country took, right? Like physical steps. So again, like think or amount of time spent with family, either online or offline. So let's go back to the point you brought up about, contact tracing and tracking. On one hand, it is an utter privacy nightmare unless we do it in the world that you and I live in, of zero knowledge proofs, and we can have complete anonymity, and you don't need to know anything about me other than, am I eligible to enter this bar? Or, can I buy this product? And you just need the answer of yes or no. You don't need to know my history. You don't need to know any of those things unless you specifically need to. But you can apply the same principles of that invasive piece of contact tracing to being able to see how much time you spent with loved ones that are family or friends. You can do the same thing with this invasive approach to the number of steps that we're taking with our health kit data, and apply that to saying the country as a whole had a net activity of X amount, right? You could do the same thing with communitas in general. And then of course you could look at your net carbon footprint or your net carbon reduction in spend. And we could apply that all and say, that is the true reference of a country's gross domestic product for the year. The product doesn't just have to be, physical product made and physical product consumed. And then 3.5% or 4%, the numbers that countries aspire to, are okay. That's fine. And so you can start making those changes, and these are not changes steeped in spiritual pie in the sky hopes, right? I think these are driven by the underlying technologies that will drive us. And the examples I gave you are AI, IoT, blockchain, right? And you can see how just in those examples, those foundations of technology are critical. And so this is not like, let's all turn into dreamers. This is a very practical way of how we go forward. And the beauty of doing that is just in those examples, we create deeper, larger digital footprints, which means if you tie that back to that rainfall and universal earned income model around the creation of value around data, you're actually generating more. And so it ties back in that a country's or a people's product for that year is not just purely financial or transactional. It is all of these things. And yet at the same time, all of these things mean that a greater foundational basic income can come back to those same peoples, right? And eventually the idea is, from the Great Reset, can we create a fitter, happier, more productive, better for the climate, right? And an economically more sound, as far as the foundation goes, society at large, right? And so if you think about it, your landlady is coming back and saying, listen, by the way, when I gave you that notice, I noticed in the last 2 months, you've done some really interesting things. You sat that first week and just moped like a little fool. And you played the victim card all of the first 10 days. And then I noticed you started changing a few things. You got up and you got out and you started doing these. I noticed I looked through the window and you were doing a lot of yoga. And I saw you going out on walks, and then you were meeting some friends, and yes, you were keeping a distance, but you all walked and chatted together. And I've never seen you spend so much time with your family, right? And you had these silent discos. I noticed that was really cool. You were dancing with all your friends around the world, and that was really cool. And then I noticed that, someone may have told you that alcohol reduces your immunity during the time of COVID, and you were having, more of like kombucha, and you were doing these, more breath work because apparently that helped you with your immunity. Wow, that's so cool. Don't stop those things. I applaud you. Continue with those kind of parties, right? And to me, yes, in many ways, I think what I said sounds so utopian, but I like to think that it's steeped in the idea that we have philosophy, principles, economics, and underlying technology that can truly drive us in that way. And while many of us were trying to think through and talk about that anyways, the Great Reset allowed it for it to happen at a planetary level, right? Where everyone has been forced to stop and think and operate in these ways. And I think it's a great opportunity. And if we can do one thing, which is not get caught in our default approach as humans, which is to go back to our comfort zones, to go back to what we perceive as normal and screw it all up, right? Lose this lease on this gorgeous home that we have, then, if we resist that slowly, not overnight, I think we'll be able to create a much, much better life for all of us after that Great Reset.
I really love that metaphor of the landlady. And I feel like for the last since World War II, I feel like everyone's just kind of seen the earth as this landlady where we need to kind of keep making rent. We kind of keep pumping up GDP so we can make rent. But I feel like what I'm trying to say there is I feel like GDP has kind of become politicized, where everyone needs to hit like their GDP targets, and if a GDP goes backwards, it's like the biggest catastrophe in the world, because it means that the lifeblood of your country has run out for whatever reason. And so it's this idea of protect GDP growth at whatever cost, whether you have to pump up consumption artificially or just do all these public investment projects for no reason, or to devalue your own currency so you can increase exports. It's like we need GDP at whatever cost. Otherwise, it's a huge failing of the government or of the country, of everyone, of all of us, right? But like you said,
Yeah.
it's like it's a completely bullshit kind of perspective, because what happens, landlady came was like, I mean, the landlady's more like your mom. She was like, I don't like what you're doing. You haven't paid rent. Also, I don't need your money. Like the house is a mess. You're a mess. You're go do some yoga, hang out, stop playing so many video games, stop watching so much porn. That's more like what's happening right now. And it's, you know, I feel like, in China, when I moved to, because I lived in New York and I moved to Beijing in 2018. And
Mhm.
so New York was already like a grind kind of place to be. But in Beijing, it's like there's this term called 996, where you're expected to just work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And,
Mhm.
when I was in high school and in China, it was the same deal, except we worked from 7, 10, 6. It was like 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. 6 days a week and a half day on Sunday. And that's just how everyone's kind of used to working. And I was
Yeah.
there and I was kind of used to it, because it's like, oh, it's just like New York. But then what happened with this virus was that everyone kind of stayed at home for 2 months and the sky didn't fall down. Everyone had food to eat and it was just kind of fine. And it was the idea of like, whoa, did we really have to do that? Was that really necessary? And these days you see, people continuing to survive and all this useless shit that we don't need kind of piling up in ports or piling up in warehouses or supermarkets. And it's like, wow, did we really need all that? Was it really sufficient to drive that much consumption just to pump up GDP? And so, but the part that I'm really scared about, quite frankly, is that, economies, and I talked about this with the group a few weeks ago, where economies and organizations and everyone has inertia. And we have this system set up to kind of maximize consumption at whatever cost. And with these incredibly brittle supply chains and these corporations spend all their money on buybacks. But even though I think it's becoming clear from a mental standpoint what the best thing to do is for people, um, the system isn't set up to work like that yet. And I
Mhm.
think there's going to
Mhm.
be a long time. And when I say long, I mean as short as 2 or 3 years, or as long as 10 plus years, where we kind of make the transition to like, oh, all of this excess production was garbage. All of this, this lowest cost, this lowest bidder, this kind of, most productivity at whatever cost. This idea that with more technology we would have more leisure time, but that was never true. That more technology would always mean, now you can work, now you can be on call at 10 p.m. when you're at home. That it's like now we have to somehow shift this entire paradigm around, and everything that we did to kind of become the winner in this old kind of competitive paradigm is just has to be thrown out the window. And so, if we look into the future a little bit, if we look at the next like 3 or 5 years, what do you think that will look like? What do you think this transition will look like? Because I think it has to be very painful, in the short run. What do you think that's going to look like?
Yeah. Look, I think you kind of paint the picture of human behavior in many ways, right? And the systems that have been created in the way that we perceive the right way to live, to be, and they've often been driven by this idea of capitalism, right? And so more production, more consumption. The attributes of success are about, individually are around how much wealth you've created, how many homes you might own, or how many cars you might drive, or how big they are, or how low they are. um, and as we look at all of these material items piling up at our ports, either of departure or arrival, the truth is, and I speak for myself obviously, but I know from conversations with a lot of friends that no one's really missing anything. Like, what we're missing is human contact. Ironically, we're not missing, no one is saying, oh my god, I really missed that expensive watch, or people are talking about how they miss hanging out with their friends, or being with people, or going to a restaurant and having the experience of communitas. um, I hope memories are not short-lived. I think a few things will change, and the timeline for it, unfortunately, is not short-term. So I think in that range that you talk about between 3 and 10 years, I think it's closer to the 10 years. Um, we're going to see a lot of things change fundamentally. And in many ways, I think this great reset, I think what happened with Brexit, what happened with 2016, and regardless of your political uh, persuasion, it really got people to wake up generationally as well and think about what kind of life they want, what kind of world they want to live in. And you see activism happening in various different ways that wasn't happening earlier. If you believe in women's rights, you've been deeply activated. If you believe in the climate crisis, you've been deeply activated. If you believe in the justice system, you've been deeply activated. If you believe in how the economic system is deeply skewed, and now we've learned also exceedingly fragile, you're deeply activated, right? If you didn't know who someone like a Elizabeth Warren was, 2 years ago, you certainly know who she is now, right? And I use examples and people like, again, as the metaphor of how people think. So I think we'll start seeing two kinds of change happening. We'll start seeing practice and policy change happen where it can change quickly and dynamically. So, policy change around UBI, not quick, not dynamic. It's not going to happen very quickly. But at the same time, I think we'll see, again, sticking with that American policy from an economy perspective, you'll see very quickly this idea that much like we have FEMA for natural disasters, there will be a fund created around infectious disease. We will see, for example, bailout packages include the idea that if you're a company that takes bailout money, you cannot do a stock buyback for 10 years. Because a lot of what happened in 2008 was these companies got these massive stimulus and bailouts, and then as things stabilized, went on a massive stock buyback. They were just pumping up shareholder value, right? We're going to start seeing that whole, think of it as a provenance chain. Do investors who put money into the markets, which then goes through institutional investors into, let's say, for example, venture funds as the path through, do those requirements and incentives change? Investors already asking the question, retail investors, what is your ESG score before I choose to put money into this ETF or what have you? Those things will continue to change. Impact investing, for example, is the fastest growing category, even more than AI or blockchain, certainly by number of people, not by value yet. That will change over time. Companies are already starting to make shifts. I'll give you an example from the work I do. At BMW, the question that is being asked is, what is the future of mobility rather than what is the future of the car? It's not just enough to think of, oh gosh, we now need to put electric powertrains into our cars, or what comes after that. It's about thinking about the wider planet. It's about thinking about the operations of cities. It's about thinking about the value to the individual owner or leaser or driver or participant in the result of that mobility. So it's starting to happen. I think there's very large inertia that it was very hard to convince them that this is a viable model. It was very hard to convince, for example, a company like Infosys, the largest or second largest consulting IT systems integrator out of India, that your massive workforce can work from home. They would have thrown the idea out and said, you know what, go home and come back and see our new campus in 2 years' time. We're going to be able to put 50,000 people there, right? They just announced last week, after a month and a half of their employees working just fine, delivering on client projects, that close to 70% of their workforce can now work from home. They'll spend on, think of the metaphor of if the last 5 years were the years of the WeWork, the idea that you would just have massive increasing office space constantly, built on potentially really weak foundations, right, with the whole throwing money at it. It's going to now be the era of homework. And you see what that means. It means that you start building some kind of infrastructure at home. It changes how commutes start happening. Will reduce the dependence on need for commuting hours, commuting infrastructure, commuting lifestyles. There's a lot of implications that will come with that. You're starting to see this move towards local over global supply chains. We will start seeing more local produce. People started cooking a lot more at home during this time because there was no choice, and realized the benefits of it. So I can start seeing, is caviar going to do slightly less well compared to, one of those, we deliver you the raw organic farm to table material and then go and cook at home, things like that. We're going to see this whole evolution with the future of work. So you can see that happening in the short term, right? So some of these things I'm talking about are things you can see happening out in a 10-year time frame. But in the next 12-month time frame, you're going to see online collaborative tools. You're going to see online management tools. You're going to see this big shift around health. The importance of, just take infectious disease as one example. You can see a whole industry being built around the idea of detection, testing, infrastructure, tracking, tracing, vaccines, policy, right? Public as well as government policy, and communication. Now, how do we make sure that we tie all of this in a slightly more communication platform built on a little bit more of fidelity of data, right? And all of these things feeding back into the idea of the GDP that I was talking about, and how, again, you start creating more value around the data. New kind of jobs will be created. They won't be in offices. So I would say you can map anywhere from the next 12 months to up to the next 10 years. And we're going to see some of these systemic changes coming out. One last point on that I'll say before, I know we're getting close to wind up, right, is we are moving rapidly towards the idea of impact, that, the hope that instead of the brightest AI and blockchain engineers sitting in San Francisco coming up with new ways to incentivize and automate Snapchat filters and Instagram filters using AI, and then create monetization models with, like, great tokenomics using the blockchain, that they would rather work on solving some of the bigger problems that humanity is going to face, and investors would rather fund that than fund, the quick returns that come from that Instagram filter system. But more importantly, hopefully we'll start moving towards this idea that we call deep impact. So, if you were the CEO of Lockheed Martin and you woke up during this great reset and said, you know what, I realized I've got a 10-person all male, all white board, and we need to bring in people of color and women of color to bring in diversity of opinion and expertise. And we do the same thing with our management team. And the COVID-19 taught us that our supply chain in China needs to be revisited, and we need to make sure that the employees there are working in the kind of facilities and have rights and health outcomes that our employees in Chicago do. And you look at, all of the Zoom meetings they're having right now and realize that they brought their carbon footprint down by 86%. We would all look at that from an ESG scoring perspective and an impact perspective and say, that's wonderful. And yet at the core, Lockheed Martin makes weapons of war, right? And the military industrial complex globally fuels that, and it feeds into the systemic problems that we have. And so deep impact is this idea that we would think going forward out of this great reset on not just the intended consequences, but the unintended consequences of what we do as individuals, as investors, as companies, and create transparent governance structures so that we can think about those unintended consequences in real time and evolve from them. And I think those are not pipe dreams. Those ideas we're starting to see people, at least start to play with. We're doing that with Rainfall. We've got a deep impact governance policy and a transparent governance board that can keep getting feedback from the community and implement aspects of that in terms of how the Rainfall system should run, right? And so I sound like an optimist even in my mind, but we have no choice. That's how we have to operate. But I think we can do it with really sound principles, and we can do it with some really thoughtful consciousness and conscious thinking. But we do it with really practical uses of technology and resources.
Gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, that does sound like a pretty solid future to be living in, especially compared to what we have right now. So I guess I've just got one last question for you because we are coming up to the hour. So, obviously I would think that in the Zoom age, you're probably doing more Zoom meetings and working from home and focusing more on stuff like Rainfall. But otherwise, how in the last 2 or 3 months or 1 or 2 months, how have you changed the way that you're living?
Like with everyone, it's been this. I have been able to look inward a lot more. I'm an extreme extrovert, and when I'm exhausted and tired, all I need to do is go and be around 100 people. So extreme extrovert, and that's been really hard to do, right? Yet at the same time, I found the evolution of how I'm dealing with meetings, how I'm dealing with people on Zoom, connecting with family. We have these family Zoom calls every second or third day, and that's been great. And most of the time it's just conversations, but that's beautiful. Not saying anything meaningful sometimes is also really useful. Not being able to access the gym, fitness is a big deal for me. I've been a bit of a fitness freak my whole life and played a lot of sport, and so not going to the gym means that I've adapted to doing kind of these body floor workouts. I've been getting on my bike, and we're a little spoiled living in a place like San Francisco, going across the Golden Gate Bridge up to the Marin Headlands, and doing every alternate day, doing kind of these 25-mile rides, climbing up to the top. And that's been fantastic. I never enjoyed walks. It was always, I don't have much time. If I have any spare time, I want to go bang out a workout at the gym and then, go play some sport. And I found that, I'm doing my calls on 2-hour walks, and I've discovered beautiful trails around, around where I live. And that's been awesome. I've really enjoyed that. I rarely was eating at home because I'm, for reasons of work and socializing, I'm out all the time at events all the time. So doing a lot of cooking at home, and starting to rediscover a little bit of love for that. And then the last part that's been really hard, and I have not adjusted to, is, and you've known with knowing me for a few years, I'm rarely in one place. I travel a lot. I'm speaking at a lot of places. I'm, opening up new chapters of SVBS in different countries, and, meetings for both investments and the other work I do. And that has been really hard. On one hand, it's nice to not have to have one bunch of clothes in a suitcase all the time. But, these trips for me were very cathartic, and I connected with people old and new, and learned so many things, and realized, how little I know, or how little I understand. And, every time you go to a different place and new context, you can learn and grow a little bit more. And I genuinely miss that. And I'm reading way more. I'm listening to many more podcasts. That's been really hard. The other thing that's been really hard is I'm a big football fan, soccer. And so I've, not just watching, but tracking and writing about, everything that happens in the sport, especially around the European leagues, primarily the, English Premier League and the La Liga and that's all gone away. Right? There's no games. We don't know when they'll come back, and some of those holes have not been filled by the 2-hour walks. But that's kind of my adaptation for the last 2 months.
Yeah, sounds like we're all going through our own big reset. You know, I don't think I told you this before, but the last year or so I've become a big Clippers fan ever since Kawhi Leonard went to the Clippers. And I felt like this was really the year where they could get to the finals and take home a championship for the first time in Clippers history. But yeah, that I don't think that's going to happen this year. You know, I hope it
Not
does,
gonna.
but I don't think it's going to happen. So that's a real shame. But
Yeah. Did you see
yeah,
it's like you? Did you see the episode of John Oliver where he says the same thing about of Liverpool, Liverpool Football Club, and he's a big fan, and they haven't won a title in 30 years. And this year they're 26 points ahead of the second place club, and they just have to win 2 more and they would win the title. They could basically sleep through the remaining games and win the title. And he's just like, 30 years we've waited, and here we are not knowing what's going to happen. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people.
yeah, it's a bummer, but you know what? They're getting paid, so I gotta count your blessings, I guess.
You've got to count your blessings. Context is everything. We're in we say this about so many things, but we're in the most interesting time of our life, right?
Yeah,
And we could come out of it on either side, and there's all of these different ideas that we all have. And I love this quote by Carl Jung, which says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. you know in so many ways, like the whole conversation we've had, whether it's UBI, UEI, whether it is changing of governance models, if it's the way we change how we think about our fitness or how we work, it almost seems like that landlady has decided what the ideas are. It's just now, for us to take and go as the people, right?
right. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Amit. This was a lot of fun. Let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, thank you.
And yeah, stay safe and best of luck.
You too. Thank you very much for having me, and we'll track back and see which of the scenarios
Played out.
we evolves in and plays out. Right.
Right, right. All right. Well, I'll talk to you later then.
Talk to you later. Take care.
Bye-bye.